over the past 40 years, we have these series of credit growth. So during an economic expansion, the private sector is taking on more debt, and during recessions, they do some degree of deleveraging, especially relative to GDP and things like that. But during those deleveraging moments, there's a variety of automatic stabilizers, as well as reduction in tax receipts, as well as purposeful kind of one-time stimulus that go in. And so what happens is a lot of that private debt that gets deleveraged instead gets transferred to the public ledger. And so if you actually look at total debt, public and private, it virtually never goes down. It only went down for like 1% during a 12-month period around the global financial crisis. For like 70 years straight, it's like nothing but a smooth line up. But it shifts around a little bit where it is. And starting with the global financial crisis in particular, but really every recession, but especially that moment, these accumulated private debts relative to a fairly small monetary base and relative to things like that, a lot of that debt started getting transferred to the public ledger. Not directly. They don't just say we're going to take that debt, but they say, look, we're going to recapitalize the banks by issuing all this stuff, and then we're going to issue bonds to pay for it. Or we're going to give out PPP loans that turn into grants, or we're going to give out corporate bailouts, or we're going to give out stimulus checks, or whatever the case may be. We're going to keep raising Social Security payments despite the fact that our tax receipts are no longer covering them. Whatever the case may be, running these deficits. And so you're kind of bailing out some of the income statements of private entities, and doing that by issuing more public bonds.
Over the last 40 years, during economic expansions, the private sector tends to increase its debt load, whereas in recessions, there's a tendency to deleverage. However, Lyn pointed out a crucial mechanism. Even as private debt decreases, public debt often takes its place, keeping the overall debt levels consistently high. This cycle isn't new. It became particularly pronounced since the global financial crisis. Government interventions, such as bank recapitalizations, bond issuances, and various stimulus measures, have shifted private liabilities to the public ledger. This is not a direct transfer, but rather a complex interplay of fiscal policies aimed at stabilizing the economy. To put this into perspective, recent data from the U.S. Department of the Treasury shows that public debt has surged to unprecedented levels, mirroring these historical patterns. The implications of this shift are profound, influencing everything from monetary policy to individual financial decisions. If you find this analysis helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest discussions.
Japan had their huge bubble in the late 80s, early 90s, massive debt buildup. They went through 30 years of private sector deleveraging. So their highly levered corporations were slowly deleveraging, while their public sector was leveraging up. It was kind of the slow motion transfer, right? And we've seen that happen before. I studied the period a lot in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to get some analogs for today. It's kind of the last time the Western world, the developed Western world, went through this kind of big debt transfer cycle. You kind of see that play out, and so far we're kind of seeing it play out. Just with obviously there's different characteristics 80 years later in a more information-based economy, but ultimately under the surface, the same thing's kind of happening. Is that private debt is rotating onto the public sector. Mm-hmm. And when you have a private debt bubble, that is disinflationary, because anytime debt kind of starts being repaid back or defaulting, that's actually reducing the money supply or otherwise slowing the prior growth of money supply. Whereas when you have very large fiscal deficits, especially if they're monetized by the central bank or the banking system more broadly, that is inflationary. And then it becomes a question of relative magnitudes. So in the global financial crisis, they ran big deficits, but those were roughly equivalent to the loan losses. And so you didn't really have, you kind of prevented deflation, for better or worse, but you didn't really get major positive inflation. Or another way of putting it is you had big inflation from a negative baseline. Whereas what we saw more recently, and this is normal with kind of late stage debt cycles, is that during the whole pandemic and lockdowns, we had massive stimulus, but not really much loan destruction. And so you had a huge increase in the money supply, delayed but substantial increase in aggregate prices as well. What kind of makes this deficit kind of hard to deal with is that it's so accumulated, right? So if you just were running large deficits, but you had an economy that was not financialized and you had a low debt to GDP ratio, then it'd be fairly easy. It'd be hard in the sense that you'd have to cut things that are popular or raise taxes in an unpopular way. But the numbers would kind of be fairly simple if you can get past the political hurdles
Mhm.
to kind of rein in the deficit. But when you have accumulated debts, and a lot of that is now interest expense building up, that's extremely hard to deal with. And then secondly, the US economy in particular, compared to, say, other Western economies, is more financialized, which means that a bigger percentage of our tax receipts are based on things like executive compensation, which is largely tied to stock issuance, which means it's heavily tied to stock prices, like stock performance in a given year, as well as just kind of how we've structured things. And so whenever we get kind of asset prices going flat to down for a year or more, generally the next year's tax receipts are weak, and so the deficit kind of blows out. And so overall, we've built up this kind of huge, not only a political machine of structural deficits, but also just the mathematically that even if you got all the most fiscal hawks in office, they would probably have trouble cutting the deficit by any meaningful degree. Because even if you cut it, you probably end up slowing down GDP and ironically blowing out the deficit further because they let it metastasize to this point.
Mhm.
And so normally what happens at this point is that the train's off the tracks. Nothing stops this train in the sense that really kind of running it hot and inflating it away is kind of mathematically one of the few options that they have.
Mhm.
And that's kind of where they're at right now. So I would say the combination of very high public debts, substantial ongoing deficits, and then pretty substantial interest payments on those existing debts has kind of put them past the event horizon where the set of choices they have is now very narrow. And so we're in this era of just deficits as far as the eye can see are going to be trillions of dollars per year.
Mhm.
And so what that should translate into is higher average fiscal driven inflation. What that manifests in prices depends on what the baseline is. So if we get a big productivity growth, let's say AI or something like that, or new energy source, then that could be pretty positive inflation off a very deep negative baseline. So you could get low inflation. On the other hand, if you have headwinds, you have things, for example, deglobalization, or AI does not take off as quickly as people think, whatever if tech or productivity driven deflation is not significant, then that fiscal driven inflation is on top of a baseline that is not very negative. And then you can get substantial price inflation. And so I think that's the era that we're in now. And that gives us similar eras to, for example, 1940s Western world. Or if you look at emerging markets, it happens all the time in recent decades, where basically fiscal deficits on an annual basis are larger than the sum of new bank loans and new corporate bond issuance. And so the credit cycles, while still important, are downplayed in their importance. And the size of the deficit is actually a key macro variable, a key investing variable, as well as obviously the political variable that it has. And that's something we have to kind of reorient around.
As Lyn Alden highlighted, the phenomenon of debt transfer from private to public sectors isn't isolated to the US. We see similar patterns globally, echoing past economic cycles like Japan's experience post-1980s bubble and the Western world's adjustments during the mid-20th century. This historical repetition sheds light on our current economic challenges, characterized by massive fiscal deficits and burgeoning public debts. Japan, for instance, has been dealing with the consequences of a decades-long debt cycle, with public debt taking the reins as private corporations deleveraged. This slow-motion transfer has implications for inflation, economic growth, and financial stability. In the US, we face a similar scenario where high public debt levels, coupled with substantial deficits and interest obligations, constrain our fiscal policy options. Thank you for joining us today on Unscripted Crypto. We hope this discussion has provided you with valuable insights into the intricate dance of debt and economic policy. For more detailed analyses and updates, make sure to follow our channel. Until next time, keep questioning and stay informed.